Okay everyone, just making a quick video to show you how to disassemble your shifter in order to change out the bushings. It's pretty simple really. I believe this is actually a 124 shifter, but the process should be the same for the standard 2.3 and 2.6 shifters or the dogleg get rag shifter. The only difference between the shifters is going to be the shape of the lower shift arms and the shape of this gate plate here at the bottom. But the steps to disassemble it and reassemble it are all exactly the same, and the bushings used in all the shifters are the same. So we'll start out here by popping these two bolts off of this end plate here. These are 10mm bolts, and this pivot shaft here is spring loaded, so when you loosen them up it is going to kind of want to pop off a little bit. So just hold on to it as you loosen it up to make sure it doesn't launch itself off. They're pretty short, so they come off pretty quick. And they are usually not too tight. Everything on these shifters seems to come apart pretty easily, depending on the condition. So you just pop that off and set it aside. There's a little washer there we'll set aside to put back on later. Then you pop these two T27 Torx bolts off of the gate plate, and again they should pop off relatively easy. And again, that will, when this comes off, it'll allow this small piece to release off the pivot rod, which again is spring loaded, so it'll kind of want to launch itself around there. And we'll just set that to the side. Now from there you can slide that whole unit apart. And you want to be careful with this part because these are held together with Belleville washers and they're spring loaded, so you don't want them to slide around and get out of alignment. What I've noticed is a pretty standard piece of 1/2-inch CPVC tubing, just some cheap plumbing from the hardware store, will slide right in there. And it's just a good measure to slide that in there, slide something in there, just to keep everything in line, so when you go to reassemble it, you don't have to worry about trying to slide those things in and out, getting to get your rod in. It'll make it a lot simpler. And you definitely don't want to pull them out because it is a real pain to put them back together in the proper orientation. I actually will be taking this one apart later to lengthen these lower shift arms for a short throw shift kit. As I've done, you can see here on this 16 valve shifter, I've got much longer lower arms here, which really reduces the throw of the shifter, but I'll get into that on a different video. So we'll set that aside, and now everything else is here. You can see these are your bushings here, your yoke bushings, and these look to be in pretty good shape, but the rubber is starting to bleed out. I'll show you, these are from my 16 valve, which I took apart as carefully as I could, and they still just disintegrated and came apart in multiple pieces. So yeah, replacing them with the Delrin, which is just a solid unit, is definitely going to make a big difference. So from there, you've got to remove a circlip off of this small rod here and this circlip off of this rod here. Pretty easy to do. I just use a small flathead screwdriver, but like with removing any circlips, you got to make sure they don't launch themselves across the shop, and they're very easy to lose. They're very small. So just keep an eye on them, keep your hands sort of covered over them to keep them from springing off and launching themselves, because they will go further than you might expect. So I'll just pop those off now. Alright. Well, that's the larger one there. It's still pretty small. I'll set that off to the side. And this smaller one here, you got to pop off the circlip, and then there's also this little plastic guard here that you need to slide off to make sure you don't lose those. So once you have the circlip and that little plastic piece off, you can then slide these through. You might have to hit them with a hammer. What I like to do is take a deep well socket, just an old crappy deep well socket that you're not too worried about busting up, and you can sort of sink the one side of the rod into the deep well socket, and then using a small punch you can punch on the pin to get it to slide through. This little thing is spring loaded, and so it'll want to shoot down a little bit as the spring puts pressure on it, so I like to pull it up to make it a little bit easier to slide that thing out, but we'll probably have to tap it a little bit with a hammer. Just take an old rag here and set it down on that. Old ratty t-shirt. That one loose. You slide that little one out. And you slide out this larger one here. And again, that's the one where I like to take a deep well socket, set it on the end, which still has a circlip on it, and then just tap it with a punch. There we go. I got so many hands here. If I could just hold it all at once. And once you extract that rod, now you can rotate this piece and slide it out of the way. And these are two T25 Torx screws. And you don't have to pull them out, you just have to loosen them up enough. It pinches down on that rod, and once you loosen them up enough, you can just slide it out of the way, and this rod slides out, and that can be removed, and you can slide the whole piece out of that plastic shroud. Now if you're really careful, I suppose you could go ahead and change the bushings like this. There is another small, slightly larger circlip on this rod here, and it's also spring loaded, holding in your upper shift lever. And I'm going to go ahead and pop that off just so I don't have to worry about dealing with it when I go to actually change the bushings. And Watch that little spring that it doesn't launch off too far. And that leaves you with this. Now you can see these bushings are in pretty good shape, but they're definitely loose. They're definitely wobbling around. This one I can really wiggle around. And the method I like to use to pop the old ones out and put the new ones in is I'll spray a little WD-40 around and put it on a vise with an appropriately sized socket that will fit just inside that hole there. And as you wind the vise down, the socket will push the old bushing out, and you can then flip it around, wind the vise down, push the old bushing out. And the new Delrin bushings, you'll notice, have on one side have a little bit of a bevel cut, and you can simply slide that bevel in. You don't really need to grease them up because Delrin is self-lubricating. So you slide that bevel in, start it up, put this thing in the vise, wind the vise down, and you just sink it in until it's flush with this, with the surface of this metal. Now this is a cast aluminum piece, so you do have to be gentle with it. You can't really just be cranking your vise down because you will pinch those two, these little ears here, and you'll pinch them together, and that could throw off your alignment a little bit. I like to get everything cleaned up really well with a good degreaser, and I like to clean them all well, but not spotless. I like to leave a thin film of grease, of the old grease on everything, but just a real thin film. And then what I'll do is when I'm reassembling it, I'll apply just some dry graphite lube, and the thin film of grease allows that dry graphite lube to stick a little bit. You don't really want to gum this thing up with a lot of grease because the tolerances within the shifter are so tight that you can actually hydrolock your shifter and just make it a bear to shift gears. So rather than doing it with the vise, because I know not everybody has one, I'll show you. You can use just a simple clamp, a C-clamp, to do the same thing. Okay, so I got a slightly different socket, and I've hit this thing with a healthy dose of WD-40 and penetrating fluid, and I've gotten it all kind of lined up, and I'm just going to show you that we'll just crank this clamp down a little bit by little bit, and you can see that old bushing slowly starting to work its way out. And you just got to take your time with it to make sure you don't wreck that piece of cast aluminum there. And there it goes. Okay, so I got the old bushings out of this yoke lever here, and got it all cleaned up pretty well, wire brushed the insides real good. I removed them by using this 12mm socket, which fit pretty perfectly to press the old bushings out, and you can use just something like a C-clamp or a vise to do that. So now I'm going to put the new Delrin bushings in. These are the old bushings, and they're not in too bad a shape, but I'll show you, even these that are in pretty good shape are still really flexible, really wobbly. So you know, the solid Delrin will make a difference in the feel of that shifter. And there's a slight bevel on the ends of these Delrin bushings, and you just fit it in to the hole, and there's a slight amount of press, about 0.2 of a millimeter, so it'll take a little bit of pressure to force those in, but it's just really easy to go in. You don't really need to grease it up. The Delrin's pretty well self-lubricating. You just got to make sure everything stays in alignment, and run them down until they're flush. And it's not getting in line there. And once you get it started, you just press right in real easy. You want to be sure not to put too much force on it though, because this is just a soft cast aluminum piece, and you can bend those ears in and it'll throw off the alignment for the pin and make reassembly a lot more difficult. So we got one in, and we'll get the other one the same way. And it's as simple as that. Okay, now for the other bushings, it's much more straightforward. These are some old linkage arms I got, and as you'll notice, these are the ends that will go to the transmission, and you'll see two of them are just bent elbowed, and the other one is flat with the pin coming out of it. And so these receive the larger bushings, and what you want to do is you'll notice that you've got the thicker ones that are not countersunk and the thicker ones that are, and these go on the elbowed ones, and you pair it up. The countersunk goes first, and then you'll slide that through the transmission and take the thicker non-countersunk one and slide that through the other side, and then you can clip it, put your clip back on, and that'll hold and be a much more solid pivot point. So you'll pair those two thicker ones, the countersunk and the non-countersunk, thicker, larger bushings, with the two linkages that have the elbows on the end. And then these other larger ones, there's two that are thinner, and they go on this arm, and obviously you slide the one on, slide it in, and some of those are harder to get to. These are the harder ones to do when the transmission's in. You can drop out the lower the rear transmission mount to let your transmission drop down a little bit, to give yourself a little bit more access, but it's still kind of difficult to reach up in there. Then as for the other end, these are the stock bushings here, but I got an open one, and you'll just use these smaller ones. These are all identical, and you just pop one in one side and pop one in the other side, and when they're sandwiched together, you can slide these onto the lower shift arms of the shifter here, and they slide onto these pins here. So those aren't too difficult. You will probably, after changing up your bushings, and especially if you after I do these, extend the shift arms a little bit, I have to slide 6mm bolt or 6mm drill bit or Allen wrench through these slots here, and I just got a drill bit on hand right now, but it'll hold these in line in the perfect neutral position, if I can get it positioned right. There we go. And then once that's going all the way through and everything's bolted in position, then you first would attach the ends of the arms to the transmission and make sure the transmission is in neutral, and then you can adjust these linkages here. Actually, there should be here's the way it should be. It should have a nut, a locking nut, and you just loosen the locking nut up, and you can thread this in and out for a little bit of adjustability to get everything, you know, with these bushings have much less forgiveness than a rubber bushing would, so you'll have to make sure everything's perfectly aligned to get them all to fit properly. But once that's all done, it's a much more solid feel to your shifter, and really helps quicken your shifts and makes everything a little bit more comfortable, a little more consistent, and definitely tightens everything up, which is what you want.